Now to the State House, where some are speaking out on legislation to change the name of the state Columbus Day holiday to Indigenous Peoples Day.
Many, including sixth graders from Amherst, made their way to Boston to testify. And Western Mass News reporter Olivia Hickey joins us live in studio with more. Olivia?
Chris, Abby, I checked in with 3 Fort River Elementary students as they waited to testify. They say they were inspired by a school project they did last year, and their former teacher tells me he's proud of them for continuing their initiative outside of the classroom. The renaming of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day across the Commonwealth is a continued conversation.
20 states and the District of Columbia observe Native American or Indigenous Peoples Day, in addition to or in replacement of Columbus Day. Let us change Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day, a holiday to honor those who first settled this land. This holiday will pay rightful tribute to the contributions of Indigenous people in Massachusetts, past, present, and future.
This Commonwealth can rightly recognize Indigenous people without throwing the Italian people collectively under the bus. But a bill that basically disregards the contributions of Italian American people is offensive to so many across this Commonwealth.
At the State House Tuesday sat a crowd of people in purple in support of the bill, including 3 sixth graders from Fort River Elementary School in Amherst.
We find it important that Indigenous people be recognized, not Columbus, because he really treated the Indigenous people in terrible ways.
Which is why they're calling for a change.
It feels like it's unfair to all the Indigenous people.
They tell Western Mass News the idea stems from a class assignment from last school year, the Civic Literacy and Organizing Project. It's part of the district's language arts curriculum.
It starts with students writing about things that they would like to see changed in the world. And then over the course of a couple of weeks, the students work together to determine something that they feel like they could work together on.
Tim Austin was their teacher last year. He tells us the class took action through outreach, talking to state legislators, and more. And then he learned about Tuesday's hearing. I
was able to just go down the hall and talk to their teachers and spend a couple minutes with them, giving them the good news. And then the 3 students took it upon themselves to recruit a parent to drive them.
He says he's proud of his students for continuing to take action beyond the classroom.
And they're really there representing their whole class and everybody who signed the petition that they created in support of this. So I'm very excited to see them and to hear how today went.
Austin assures me he will ask the students about their experience when he sees them in school tomorrow. Meantime, Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day falls on Monday, October 9th this year. Reporting live in studio, Olivia Hickey, Western Mass News.